If you close your eyes and think of the year 2010, a very specific sound echoes in your mind. It is a drone, a rhythmic, buzzing wall of sound that filled stadiums, spilled over television broadcast, and embedded itself into global popular culture. It was the sound of the Vuvuzela. And on June 11th of that year, inside Soccer City in Johannesburg, that sound reached a crescendo. The moment is frozen in time. Siphiwe Tshabalala receives a perfectly weighted through ball. He drives into the left side of the penalty area, shifts his weight, and unleashes a thunderous, left-footed strike into the far top corner of the Mexican net. The commentator, Peter Drury, immortalized the moment with words that still give football fans goosebumps: goal for South Africa. A goal for all of Africa.
Goal for South Africa! Goal for all Africa! Jabulila! Rejoice!
Jamvila Bafana Bafana. Rejoice. That single goal was not just a sporting highlight. It was a cultural explosion, a release of decades of geopolitical tension, sporting exile, and the heavy burden of proof. It was the moment the world truly met Bafana Bafana, the boys, but to understand how South Africa arrived at that pitch-perfect moment of joy, and to understand why the years that followed were marked by agonizing heartbreak and structural decay, we have to look far beyond a single football match. The story of Bafana Bafana is the story of South Africa itself. It is a narrative of a team built from the ashes of apartheid, thrust into the dizzying heights of continental dominance, plunged into a dark age of administrative failure. And now, finally, finding its way back toward a modern renaissance. Football arrived in South Africa in the late 19th century, carried across the oceans by British colonial soldiers. It spread rapidly, but from its very inception, the beautiful game was systematically dismantled by the ugly reality of racial segregation. Long before the formal implementation of apartheid in 1948, institutional division dictated who could play, where they could play, and who they were allowed to play against. By the early 20th century, South African football was a fragmented mirror of its fractured society. The All-White Football Association of South Africa, FASA, was formed in 1892, commanding all the state funding, the best facilities, and official international recognition. Meanwhile, marginalized communities built their own parallel football universes out of sheer love for the game. The South African Indian Football Association emerged in 1903, followed by the South African Bantu Football Association in 1933 and the South African Black Football Association in 1936. In the townships, sprawling, under-resourced settlements like Soweto, football became more than a game. It became a survival mechanism, a space of creative expression, and a weekly escape from the grinding indignities of a white minority regime. On these dusty, uneven pitches, a distinct style of play was born. It was called Diski, a brand of football defined by rapid-fire short passes, audacious showmanship, clever trickery, and a joyful, rhythmic expression that mirrored the music of the townships. Yet, on the world stage, this immense pool of black and brown talent did not exist. FASA represented the country internationally, sending an exclusively white team on a tour of South America as early as 1906. A pivotal turning point arrived in the 1950s. In 1956, South Africa joined Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia as a founding member of the Confederation of African Football, CAF. However, the contradictions of the apartheid state quickly collapsed under international scrutiny. South Africa's constitution legally forbade racially mixed teams from participating in competitive sport. When the inaugural Africa Cup of Nations, AFCON, was organized in Khartoum in 1957, FASA announced they could only send an all-white squad or an all-black squad, but never a mixed one. The rest of Africa stood united in its refusal to accept this institutionalized bigotry. South Africa was promptly disqualified from the tournament and, by 1958, formally expelled from CAF. What followed was a decades-long game of political cat-and-mouse within FIFA. Sir Stanley Rouse, the English president of FIFA throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, consistently tried to shield South Africa from expulsion, arguing stubbornly that sport should remain separate from politics. FASA was suspended, then briefly reinstated, then suspended again. But the global tide was turning. Following the horrific, state-sponsored violence of the Soweto uprising in 1976, international outrage reached a boiling point. FIFA could no longer look the other way. In 1976, South Africa was formally expelled from world football's governing body. For nearly 2 decades, South Africa became a ghost nation on the global football map. A generation of world-class talents, players like Jomo Sono and Kaiser Motaung, spent their absolute primes playing in domestic leagues cut off from the rest of the planet, or escaping overseas to find a livelihood in the North American Soccer League. They played in packed local derbies between Orlando Pirates and Kaiser Chiefs, fueling an intense domestic passion, but they were starved of the ultimate test, international competition. As the Berlin Wall fell and the foundations of apartheid began to crumble under the weight of internal resistance and international sanctions, the sports boycott was lifted. In 1991, the various racially divided football bodies within South Africa merged into a singular, unified entity, the South African Football Association, SAFA. A year later, FIFA officially readmitted the nation into the global football family. On July 7, 1992, the long exile officially ended. On a rainy night at the Kings Park Stadium in Durban, the newly christened national team stepped out onto the pitch to face Cameroon, an African powerhouse that had captured the world's imagination at the 1990 World Cup. The team was a beautifully diverse representation of a changing country, featuring black, white, and colored players standing side by side. Doctor Khumalo, a midfield maestro possessing the elegance and Diski flair of the townships, orchestrated the play. Lucas Radebe anchor-locked the defense. South Africa won the match 1-0 courtesy of a penalty by Doctor Khumalo. The Rainbow Nation had found its heartbeat, and journalists quickly adopted a Zulu phrase affectionately shouted by fans in the stands to nickname the team Bafana Bafana. However, the initial euphoria was quickly met with a harsh reality check. Decades of isolation had left South Africa tactically naive. They failed to qualify for the 1994 Africa Cup of Nations and were easily brushed aside in their attempts to reach the 1994 FIFA World Cup. International football had evolved, it was faster, more physical, and highly organized. South Africa had the raw talent, but they lacked the collective tactical structure to compete. Everything shifted when Clive Barker was appointed head coach in 1994. Known affectionately as the Dog, Barker was a master motivator who understood that tactics were meaningless without emotional harmony. He didn't try to strip away the expressive Diski style of his players. Instead, he built a disciplined, modern tactical framework around it. Because Kenya withdrew from hosting duties, South Africa was chosen to host the 1996 Africa Cup of Nations. It was a staggering responsibility. The country was still in a fragile transition state, reeling from political violence and the immense task of nation building. Just a year prior, the Springboks had won the 1995 Rugby World Cup, providing a powerful moment of racial reconciliation. Now, it was football's turn, the sport that truly belonged to the masses. The tournament opened on January 13, 1996, at FNB Stadium against a formidable Cameroon squad. Bafana Bafana did not just win, they blew the indomitable Lions away in a dazzling 3-0 victory. Phil Masinga opened the scoring, followed by goals from Mark Williams and John Shoes Mashu. The country caught fire, led by the towering captain Neil Tovey, a white defender who commanded the respect of every player in the squad. Bafana Bafana marched through the tournament. They beat Angola, bypassed Algeria in the quarter-finals, and systematically dismantled the star-studded Ghana side 3-0 in the semi-finals. The final on February 3, 1996, against Tunisia was a masterclass in collective destiny. With the iconic President Nelson Mandela sitting in the stands wearing a matching yellow Bafana Bafana jersey. The tension was suffocating. The match remained deadlocked until the 73rd minute when super sub Mark Williams rose high to glance a header into the back of the net. 2 minutes later, Williams struck again, intercepting a pass and sliding a low, left-footed shot past the Tunisian goalkeeper. The final whistle blew. FNB Stadium exploded into a wall of sound. Nelson Mandela handed the trophy to Neil Tovey, capturing an image that came to symbolize the triumph of the new South Africa. Bafana Bafana were the champions of Africa on their very first attempt. The 1996 triumph was not a fluke, it was the launchpad for South Africa's golden generation. Suddenly, European scouts realized that the tip of the African continent was teeming with elite, cut-price talent. Players who had spent their lives in townships were signed by major clubs across England, Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands. Lucas Radebe moved to Leeds United, where his uncompromising, elegant defending eventually earned him the team captaincy and a legendary status so profound that the local indie rock band the Kaiser Chiefs named themselves after Radebe's former South African club. Phil Masinga signed for Leeds and later Bari in Serie A. John Shoes Mashu took his creative talents to Turkey. While Helman Khalili brought his devastating pace to Europe, most notably, a young, clinical striker named Benni McCarthy burst onto the scene. Blessed with ruthless predatory instincts and physical strength, McCarthy would go on to become the country's all-time leading goal scorer with 31 goals, eventually winning the UEFA Champions League under Jose Mourinho at Porto. With this glittering array of talent, Bafana Bafana achieved their next great milestone, qualifying for their first World Cup, France '98. Under the guidance of French coach Philippe Troussier, the team faced a brutal baptism of fire in their opening match, losing 3-0 to eventual world champions France. However, they proved their resilience by earning fighting draws against Denmark, 1-1, with a goal from McCarthy, and Saudi Arabia, 2-2, via McCarthy brace. Though they exited in the group stage, they had shown they belonged on the world's grandest stage. Earlier that same year, Bafana Bafana had marched all the way back to the final of the 1998 AFCON in Burkina Faso, losing out to an excellent Egypt side. In 2000, they picked up a bronze medal at the tournament. This was a team that consistently operated at the elite absolute peak of African football. By the time the 2002 FIFA World Cup in South Korea and Japan came around, Bafana Bafana, coached by local legend Jomo Sono, were a highly sophisticated outfit. They were agonizingly close to making global history. After securing a dramatic 2-2 draw with Paraguay via a late Quinton Fortune penalty, they earned their first ever World Cup victory, a 1-0 win over Slovenia, courtesy of a Sayabonga Nomvit goal. This set up a thrilling, winner-takes-all clash with the star-studded Spain side. South Africa fought valiantly, matching the European giants stride for stride, but eventually fell in a narrow 3-2 defeat. Simultaneously, Paraguay defeated Slovenia 3-1. In a devastating stroke of heartbreak, South Africa tied with Paraguay on both points and goal difference, but were eliminated from advancing to the round of 16 simply because Paraguay had scored one more total goal across the group stage. It was a cruel exit, but it felt like a minor bump in the road. Little did anyone know, this narrow defeat in Tejan was the absolute high-water mark of Bafana Bafana's initial era of competitiveness. The sunset was fast approaching. To understand how a team went from competing with Spain on equal terms in 2002 to failing to even qualify for the Africa Cup of Nations by 2010, one must look away from the pitch and look directly at the boardroom. The decline of Bafana Bafana is an object lesson in how institutional instability and administrative incompetence can destroy a golden generation of athletic talent. Following the 2002 World Cup, SAFA entered a period of utter chaos. The federation lacked a long-term football philosophy. Instead of investing heavily in nationwide youth academies, coaching education, and grassroots infrastructure, the administrators focused on a short-term, reactionary cycle of hiring and firing head coaches. Between 2002 and 2010, Bafana Bafana cycled through an astonishing 10 different head coaches. High-profile international managers like Carlos Alberto Pereira and Joel Santana were brought in on astronomical contracts, only to be fired or leave when instant results didn't materialize. Local coaches were treated as temporary placeholders, given zero job security and even less structural support. Without tactical continuity, the identity of the team evaporated. The beautiful, fluid Diski style that combined flair with European discipline disintegrated into disjointed, uninspired football. At the same time, the domestic Premier Soccer League, PSL, grew into a financial juggernaut. Backed by massive corporate sponsorships and lucrative television broadcast deals, the PSL became the wealthiest league on the African continent. Ironically, this commercial success crippled the national team. South African players no longer felt the burning professional need to move to Europe to earn a lucrative living. They could stay at home, earn massive salaries playing for clubs like Mamelodi Sundowns, Orlando Pirates, or Kaizer Chiefs, and remain in their comfort zones. As a result, the national team went from having an entire starting 11 playing in top-tier European leagues to a squad dominated by domestic players who lacked exposure to the unforgiving speed and tactical intensity of global football. The consequences were swift and brutal. Bafana Bafana crashed out of successive Africa Cup of Nations tournaments in the group stages in 2004, 2006, and 2008. The ultimate humiliation arrived in 2010, when South Africa failed to even qualify for the AFCON held in Angola. If they had not automatically qualified as hosts for the 2010 World Cup, they would have missed that historic tournament entirely. Despite the catastrophic dip in form, the awarding of the 2010 FIFA World Cup to South Africa, the first time the tournament would ever be held on African soil, injected a massive, desperate wave of energy into the country. The tournament was far bigger than football. It was a massive branding exercise for a democratic South Africa, a chance to show the world that an African nation could host a flawless, world-class mega-event. Billions of rands were poured into constructing magnificent architectural wonders like Cape Town Stadium and upgrading Moses Mabhida Stadium in Durban. As June 2010 approached, the national anxiety regarding Bafana Bafana's competitiveness reached a fever pitch. Carlos Alberto Pereira was rehired to steady the ship. He took the squad into isolation camps in Brazil and Germany, desperately trying to build fitness and tactical cohesion through sheer repetition. When the opening match against Mexico arrived, the entire country was unified in a way it hadn't been since 1996. The streets were in sea of yellow jerseys, cars flew the multicolored national flag from their windows. Tshabalala's iconic opening goal sent the country into an absolute state of delirium. For 50 minutes, it felt like the fairy tale was real. But top-tier football is indifferent to narratives. Mexico fought back, exploiting a defensive lapse to equalize through Rafael Marquez. Leaving the match tied at 1-1, in the second match against the ruthless Uruguay side led by a peak Diego Forlan, South Africa's tactical deficiencies were completely laid bare. They were comfortably outclassed in a painful 3-0 defeat in Pretoria, entering the final group match against the collapsing, dysfunctional France squad. Bafana Bafana needed a minor miracle. They played with immense pride and heart, roaring to a 2-1 victory over the former world champions thanks to goals from Doctor Khumalo and Katlego Mfila. It was a historic victory, but it was not enough. Uruguay beat Mexico 1-0, meaning Mexico advanced on goal difference. South Africa became the first host nation in the 8-year history of the FIFA World Cup to exit in the group stage, while the tournament itself was a triumphant success for the country's infrastructure and pride. For Bafana Bafana, it was a poignant reminder of how far they had fallen from the elite table of world football. The decade following the 2010 World Cup can only be described as a long, grueling trek through the international wilderness. The structural rot inside South African football development had deeply set in, and the national team paid a heavy, repetitive price. South Africa completely failed to qualify for the FIFA World Cups in 2014, Brazil, 2018, Russia, and 2022, Qatar. For a nation that boasted the richest domestic league on the continent, being completely absent from the world's prime sporting event for over a decade was an absolute sporting tragedy. Their AFCON record was equally depressing. They consistently swung between failing to qualify entirely or suffering meek, uninspiring exits in the early knockout rounds. When they did manage a deep run, such as reaching the quarterfinals in 2013 on home soil or pulling off a shocking round of 16 upset over host Egypt in 2019 via a late Thembinkhasai Lorch goal, it always felt like individual moments of brilliance masking a deeply broken system. Rather than the result of sustained development, the public grew deeply cynical. Fans who had once packed stadiums wore their yellow jerseys with a sense of ironic detachment or abandoned the national team altogether to focus entirely on European club football. Bafana Bafana had become a punchline in their own country, a symbol of unfulfilled potential and bureaucratic stagnation. Every great documentary narrative requires a turning point where a team hits rock bottom and is forced to reconstruct itself from the foundation up. For South Africa, that moment came in 2021. After failing to qualify for the 2021 Africa Cup of Nations, SAFA took a massive gamble. They appointed Hugo Broos, a stubborn, plain-spoken Belgian manager who had previously guided Cameroon to an unexpected AFCON title in 2017. Broos arrived in South Africa and looked at the landscape with completely unclouded eyes. He didn't care about reputations, player market values, or corporate pressure. He immediately diagnosed the core issue: the national team was too old, too slow, and entirely too comfortable. In his very first press conferences, Broos did the unthinkable. He publicly criticized the quality of the domestic PSL, arguing that it lacked the intensity required for international football. He then proceeded to ruthlessly clear out the old guard. Iconic names and seasoned veterans were dropped. In their place, Broos blooded a hungry, dynamic crop of young players who were willing to run, press, and sacrifice for the collective badge. Crucially, Broos found a brilliant shortcut to tactical cohesion. Rather than trying to forge a team out of disparate players scattered across 20 different clubs, he anchored his entire starting lineup around a dominant domestic club, Mamelodi Sundowns. Sundowns, managed by the tactically brilliant Rulani Mokoena, had been dominating African club football with an ultra-modern, high-possession, positional play system. By taking the spine of the Sundowns team, including midfield maestro Teboho Mokoena, dynamic winger Thapelo Moina, experienced playmaker Themba Zwane, and world-class goalkeeper Ronwen Williams, Broos gave Bafana Bafana an immediate tactical chemistry that other national teams spent years trying to build. The grand synthesis of the Hugo Broos project came together at the 2023 Africa Cup of Nations in Ivory Coast. Nobody expected anything from South Africa. They were drawn into a difficult group and written off by pundits across the continent. What followed was an absolute masterclass in tournament football. After an initial slip-up against Mali, South Africa played with a tactical maturity and defensive solidity that stunned their critics. They dismantled Namibia 4-0 and drew with Tunisia to march into the knockout stages. In the round of 16, they faced their ultimate test, Morocco, the Atlas Lions, who were fresh off a historic semi-final run at the 2022 World Cup and ranked as the #1 team in Africa. South Africa put on a defensive clinic. They absorbed Morocco's pressure with absolute composure and struck with lethal precision. Evidence Makopa scored a brilliant opener, and in stoppage time, Teboho Makona curled a magnificent free kick into the top corner to seal a historic 2-0 victory. The quarter-final against Cape Verde solidified another legendary chapter in South African football folklore. After a grueling, scoreless 120 minutes, the match went to a penalty shootout. Goalkeeper and captain Ronwen Williams pulled off a historic feat, saving 4 out of 5 penalties, a world record performance in a major international tournament shootout. Though they narrowly lost a heartbreaking semi-final to longtime rivals Nigeria on penalties, Bafana Bafana bounced back to defeat the Democratic Republic of Congo to claim the bronze medal. More than the medals, they had won back the respect and love of their nation. This wasn't a lucky team, this was a highly organized, elite, modern football unit playing with immense tactical sophistication. As we look at the landscape of South African football today, the feeling is completely different from the bleak apathy of the previous 2 decades. The bronze medal at the 2023 AFCON was not a final destination, it was a profound proof of concept. Bafana Bafana entered their qualifiers for the upcoming FIFA World Cup sitting in a highly favorable position at the top of Group C, primed to return to the world's biggest stage. The dark ages of administrative chaos have slowly given way to a structured, modern football vision. The journey of Bafana Bafana is a profound testament to the fact that talent alone is never enough. A football team requires a clear identity, structural stability, and a deep, authentic connection to the people it represents. From the dark, segregated dust pitches of the 20th century townships to the global, neon-lit heights of the 1996 and 2010 triumphs, from the agonizing collapse of the wilderness years to the modern tactical renaissance under Hugo Broos, Bafana Bafana have always reflected the soul of South Africa. They are reminded that no matter how deep the exile, no matter how severe the fall, with the right structure, the right vision, and that classic, irrepressible Diski flair, the boys will always find their way back home.